Thank you, Crystal. Okay, a very good evening, afternoon or morning, depending on which time zone you're on. Thanks for listening at this time. I always appreciate people taking time off their life, to support BlockPlay. Just a very quick one to introduce myself. Of course, again, as Crystal introduced earlier, my name is Don, and basically I'm the co-creator of BlockPlay. Just in case you're wondering what BlockPlay is about, I think essentially we are big fans of Web3, and of course that encompasses blockchain gaming, metaverse and NFT. We're also big fans of believing that there's no technology without people. So BlockPlay is really about the people. It's really about bridging people, creating partnership and meaningful and authentic manner. But at the same time, also kind of getting together, the brightest mind, in the industry, to be looking at some of the pain points, in the industry, and basically sharing their knowledge, to help each other, and basically to help the industry to be stronger, bigger, and to be more authentic as well. And if everyone is striking a partnership and basically building a bigger Web3 space, I believe that it will also benefit everyone in the ecosystem. So basically, that's BlockPlay. Thanks for listening in. And today's session is day 2 of panel session 6. Basically, it's titled "Big Brother is Watching." Of course, repeating what's ever on the screen right now, we are talking about insights on the Web3 legal and regulatory landscape. To set a quick context, of course, I don't have to talk about the crypto winter. I'm sure everyone knows the crypto winter is here to a certain extent, right? With the crash of Luna UST, there's been talked to the bits, and of course with Celsius, the issue with them. Generally, even across the board, we just see a general, nosediving or dip in the floor price of NFTs or GameFi tokens, and the likes. So basically, there are a bunch of people who are feeling the pain, right? So in this kind of situation, really seek to further polarize. I'll say generally, in very simplistic sense, grouping people into 2 camps. Of course, you have the camp of people who are now saying that Web3 space basically need more regulation, right? Because it is about protecting interests, especially retail investors, or people who are just basically active in that space. Versus I'll say in a very simplistic way, camp 2, which talks about the whole nature of decentralization is about promoting and really improving on self-governance, and really pitching into this whole conversation. I'm quite honored to be having 3 esteemed speakers, as Crystal earlier introduced as well. Of course, again, just repeating, Eric from Dedoco, Jeremy from Monster Ventures, and Nicholas from Rajah Tann Asia. Each of them has very unique perspectives to the whole conversation. And Eric basically come from a service provider or a product builder. Jeremy basically from a venture capital background, and of course Nicholas being in the legal space. So I think without further ado, I wouldn't do a better job than themselves doing an introduction. So I would like to kind of quickly just hand the baton to start the session by getting each of them to do a quick introduction of their background as well as what the company does. So that will help with the session and give our audience a little bit more context in terms of who they are. So without further ado, if you don't mind, maybe I'll start with Jeremy, if you can take over that. Jeremy.
Hi, I'm a VC in Monster Ventures. We are investing in founders that are transforming millions of lives across Southeast Asia. Our team were all former founders and very passionate about product market fit, economics, and all the geeky things that happens with really building the business from the ground up, since we've all done it before. Also, on my personal side, I also run the Brave Southeast Asia Tech Podcast at www.jeremyout.com. That's Southeast Asia's #1 tech leadership podcast with tens of thousands of followers. And every week we interview 2 founders, VCs, operators about Southeast Asia and their own leadership journey. Previously, I am a graduate of UC Berkeley and a Harvard MBA. I built 2 companies. One I bootstrapped to profitability and sold. And the second one would be a startup in education tech that I raised pre-seed, seed, Series A, and eventually sold as well. So have a lot of experience on the founder side, and now I'm on the other side of the table and happy to help. I've also personally angel invested in Web3 startups as well. So it's been interesting to see how they've performed over time and, brainstorm about what's going on in the market today. And I'm excited to share more about what life is going to be and how our kids or grandkids will be operating with crypto and Web3 in the future.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing, Jeremy. Yeah, over to you, Eric.
Hey. Thanks, Don. Just a quick background of Dedoco and how it's relevant in today's conversation, right? So again, quick background now. Dedoco was started back in 2020 by Daphne and Ernie. So I came in much later towards the end of 2021. I think the problem that Dedoco was trying to solve is on the document management system space. Currently still very centralized, system-centric. Integrating everything together is really costly, right? Limiting to what's available by the solution provider. That's where the whole Web3 and what's the Dedoco comes in, right? We stand for decentralized document connector. So the first syllable of each of those words form our brand, like where we create a layer and business process application to piece everything together in various segments of that document management. So we chose this to start the journey with digital signatures. I think that's what we've been known in the market to do, like something everyone needs and absolutely accelerated during that whole lockdown and pandemic circuit breaker thing, right? So we turn every document that passes through our platform into a blockchain decentralized document, so no longer system-centric. And further along with that Web3 narrative, we don't store your documents as well. That's our key value proposition that is different from the other service providers. The base document comes directly from the client's repository. We collect signatures, then off it goes back into the client's repository. Like we don't store anything. We just post a hash of the document onto the blockchain, which facilitates that immutability, tamper-proof, and full audit trail. I think later part in this conversation also, I would like to touch on how we are approaching this Web3 conversation, because the market is a little bit, you put resistance when you mention blockchain and Web3. So we created a Web2 user experience, but a Web3 value proposition, right? So just to end off with a quick shout out, like if anyone here from the attendees, like feel free to try it out at dedoco.com. Like no credit cards required. We allow free 5 documents to be signed every month. So do sign up. And before my finance team, like Chloe, if she's here tuning in, like reduces this limit. Yeah. So that's from me. Thanks, Don.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, we are over at BlockPlay X. We're also a big fan of women in tech as well. We were actually originally we would love to welcome your co-founder, basically Daphne. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it, but I'm sure we will definitely have a good time and definitely have a lot of knowledge sharing from you as well. Thanks for joining us, Eric. Yeah, thank you so much. Nicholas, over to you. Yeah.
Thanks, Don. So basically, I'm a lawyer, which makes me immediately more boring, and I earn far less money than my fellow panelists here. My background, so I've been in Rajah Tann now for about 13 years. My background is intellectual property law. So, I think if you look around, there's actually no such thing as a true Web3 lawyer, simply because it's just too new. So most of us have done things that are relevant to the space in some way. And so within my own firm, we've got different lawyers in different areas who have relevant experience in different parts that would be relevant to Web3. My personal practice space relates to intellectual property and technology. So a key interest to me has been NFTs and the way laws work with the way NFTs are traded and created on the Web3 space. So that's been a very interesting experience for me. I recently went to NFT NYC, which was an eye-opening experience in terms of the number of people who are interested in that area and the passion that they had and all the different ways that they can apply NFTs to the various use cases that they can think of. So it's a very exciting space. But at the same time, obviously there is a scope for a lot of pitfall in terms of a lack of understanding of the existing laws, and that's something that I hope to share with you today.
Thank you, Nicholas. Yeah, I'm also a big fan of the fact that, what makes us humans, end of the day, also our imagination, our ingenuity, right? In terms of how we can imagine up things, to make everyone's life better as well. Yeah, so before we come to the first question, I would like to quickly just dive into a quick the chat room is open. So for those of you who have any questions at any time, feel free to chat it in. Okay, you don't have to wait until, prompting. Basically, if you have a burning question, just go straight in. If you have any comments or things that you want to direct to specific speakers, do chat it into that space as well. And to dive into the first question quickly, the reason why we have our 3 speakers here, as I briefly mentioned earlier, is because they come from different perspective or different background within the industry itself. Web3 itself, of course, is pretty vast. What we are trying to achieve here, we're not a workshop, so we're not trying to be comprehensive. So do pardon us the fact that we will be kind of like picking a little bit here and there, and a lot of these are more opinion based. What we like to do on the first question is, perhaps we'll get everyone to share, looking at the current climate, in your own personal role, within this space, have you ever come across any, what do you think is the role of regulations and, or laws in general, and what kind of role does it play in this space? And also if that, any specific ones that, that interest you, that you picked out, that you think is really useful or really prohibiting, I think that'll be useful. Just very quick general sharing about the overall climate and how do you think laws and regulation play a role in the space? Yeah. It's open to anyone. We can start with Jeremy or Eric or whatnot. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, happy to share. So, at the end of the day, regulation is a function of society. And what that means is that people vote for lawmakers and lawmakers act to serve the requirements and needs of the people. And what that means on average means obviously multiple things. One is obviously fostering innovation is a key requirement, advancing the economy, and also I think protecting the people who are disadvantaged is a big component of what society requires and requests of our policymakers. So overall, regulation is neutral, it's neither good or bad. The question is whether it's effective regulation or ineffective regulation versus the requirements of society. So the role of regulation as a result, moving forward in the context of blockchain is, in the context of this new technology, what are the guardrails that we need to have and what are the aspirations that we have for blockchain? Is there a way for people to make money? Is there a way for people to have jobs? Is there a way to invest? Is there a way to transform our businesses? And those are all questions that both the technology is working out. Society is also figuring out what they want to do with it, and also what regulators are trying to figure out of how to foster the best climate. And that's going to vary market by market and time period by time period.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I can add a little bit on that front, right? So very specific to my use case, or rather Dedoco's use case, we are playing in the Web3 and blockchain enterprise space, right? So away from crypto on regulatory on that part. The act that's really in tandem with our space right now would be the Electronic Transaction Act. So this is the 2010 Electronic Act that we're looking at in Singapore. But again, a massive caveat here, I'm not a lawyer guy, so whatever I say, please do double check with your lawyer or Nicholas from here. But this is our background homework, right? So there's nothing much right now that specifically regulates us on a Web3 perspective. I'm speaking on Singapore's perspective, right? I'm seeing a lot more deliberate wordings coming from US states, which could potentially be our next market. But in Singapore itself, it's a little bit muted from our own research. Our next market, which was in Australia, I was sharing with the panelists before we come on this call, is the concept of witnessing, right? Specifically for digital signatures. Like just a couple of months ago, like what's the concept of witnessing a digital signature if you're going to get it separate in your own email to say that if I have I witnessed the original signature, signing it off, and for me to have a disjointed experience and saying and putting in my signature as a witness itself, right? So how we are looking at it, and we hope to actually make this use of allowing witness to be kind of legitimate in a digital signing is through video, right? In a single session itself, if I could invite, or rather the signatory invites me as a witness in that whole one session, and to really literally see him sign off on that part, and then I sign off as a witness, and then that full experience itself becomes a single evidence trail that is then put up on the blockchain, and eventually, hopefully, with regulations that allows it to be fully admissible into court as saying that, hey, this is indeed something that's legitimate. So I hope that makes sense to the audience here. So yeah.
Definitely. Over to you, Nicholas.
Okay, so from my perspective, I think that if you look at the regulatory landscape, it's always important that as a Web3 participant, it's always important to remember that there is a old-fashioned set of laws that governs everything that we do, even in the Web3 space. So from my perspective, a lot of these laws, they were written a long time ago, and it's very difficult to apply them to what we know in the Web3 space. Like, for example, the Copyright Act was written at a time when obviously there were no computers. Yet at some stage, computer source code showed up, and what it just basically did was that determined that computer source code was protected as a literary work, means like what you would find in a book under the Copyright Act. So with that in mind, if you look at something like NFTs, and a lot of people would be of the view that if they bought an NFT, they own the IP in the image that's tagged the NFT, which is true in certain cases like Bored Ape Yacht Club. There is something funny about that concept when you try to map it back to what's inside the Copyright Act. So for example, in the Copyright Act in Singapore, there is a provision in there that says that assignment of copyright has to be in writing and signed between the parties. So if I'm assigning my rights in the image as the artist to you as a purchaser of the NFT, there's nothing here that's in writing or signed between the parties. So there's an open question here as to whether or not an effective assignment has taken place. So that's something that the law eventually would have to consider. Maybe it will go before the court. Maybe Parliament will have to look at it. And maybe rewrite the act accordingly. But that's something that we'll have to look out for. And so apart from statutes, there's also traditional common law, which is something that basically the courts have determined over the years. And one of this relates to the question of contractual terms and how those are set out for you. So in the case of NFTs, going back to that, if you don't own the image that of the token that you purchase, the other option is that a license is granted to you. So that license will provide for certain terms that say what you can and cannot do in relation to that image that's tied to the NFT. And ownership of that image remains with the NFT artist. Now, the issue I have with that is that, usually when you buy an NFT off OpenSea, you're not presented with any terms and conditions. You just buy the NFT. And if you want to find out what the terms and conditions are, you have to go back to the website of the NFT, or you have to go to the Discord page, and maybe the terms and conditions will be there. But it's up to you to do that. And that kind of doesn't accord with the way things are done. Normally when you download an app or you install software to your phone or your PC, you're presented with a set of terms and conditions that you need to click yes, I accept in relation to it. That's something that's missing in this space. So there may be a case that someone may one day, have a court case where he takes the view that, look, I was not presented with these terms and conditions. I'm not bound. I obviously understood something else. So there's an area that's potentially ripe for argument in court or dispute further down the road, and we'll have to see how that goes. I think the last point I wanted to make was, there are certain things, there are certain areas of the Web3 space that we have to again tie back to the concepts of law. And I think one area is DAOs in particular, where they kind of have a quasi corporate kind of identity, but actually a lot of them don't have a separate corporate identity, in the sense that they don't have a registered company or an LLC or anything tied to it. I think this may tie into one of the questions that's on the Q&A at the moment, which is, whether someone needs to register a business in the country that they're in. And I think the key concern here really is that the reason you register a business is to give you, a limitation of liability. So your own personal assets are not affected. So if you're in a case where you're participating in a DAO and you're not a separate legal entity has not been established, you may face a situation whereby your own personal assets are at risk if you cause loss to somebody else. So that's another area that we have to take into account when looking at the Web3 space.
Very insightful. Thanks for sharing, Nicholas. With what you just shared, suddenly an impromptu question pops to mind that I want to kind of raise it up. Even the fact that, like what Nicholas has mentioned, a lot of laws and regulations are often kind of built upon probably older set of laws, that we fall reference on. And Web3 being such a new space, a lot of it has kind of like crafting and refining, as we go. So I really like to, maybe pick Jeremy's brain a little bit in terms of, how that presents set of challenge in terms of, from the investor point of view. I'm sure some of our audience, sitting in the audience right now might be also personal investors in a retail sense or in an institutional sense. What kind of challenges does it pose, in terms of this regulatory landscape in the company they're investing in? Because essentially a lot of them are coming to the space in terms of, doing token releases, token sales, and things like these, and whether laws encompass all these, and whether as an investor, when you're going through all this, how do you navigate all this, and what are the challenges? Perhaps it would be interesting to pick Jeremy's brains a little bit on that.
So I think there's three types, right? Of what we're talking about. There's law that everybody agrees on, right? Then there's law or the non-existence of law for private transactions between different parties. And the third is bad faith actors, right? So, I think that's how we should be thinking about that, right? The first is a lot of people, like, for example, what Nicholas has shared is, as society, we have decided as a whole that we want to limit the liability of individuals by letting them have the ability to set up corporations that have the ability to take out company loans, to enter agreements and have that right to be able to sign contracts, and to also have liabilities be limited and protected by a court so they can enter bankruptcy, so on and so forth. Because society as a whole, over hundreds of years, or from the time of Italy and Venice and all the way to the Dutch to today, have realized that, if you allow individuals to take on the unsustainable cost of a potential bankruptcy, nobody wants to set up a business. And if you don't want to set up a business or a fractional business, then you can't build amazing things. You can't build General Electric, you can't build Apple, you can't build all these things that are just based on that common understanding that society wants you to build a business, and as a result is willing to socialize the cost of a bank company failure to protect you as an individual to be an entrepreneur, right? Which is why today on the World Bank and so on and so forth, in terms of ease of doing business or everything, we are all incentivizing people to have more business-friendly legislation, right? And that's why Singapore is known as a business hub and a finance hub, because of its law on certain things. And so lots of Web3 startups are happily building using common law or American law, whatever you want to have to build. And it's not an issue at all. Like, nobody is unhappy about limited liability, right? On the entrepreneur, right? I myself built a company and I was happy to have limited liability because I knew that I can build something and that, no matter what, my family's protected, right? I'm doing my best I can. I think the second cluster we're talking about is the fact that we don't understand the law for some of the use cases that we're developing, but that we are carrying out private transactions between various parties, right? And in general, I think the common understanding is if the other person is a sophisticated person and you are a sophisticated person, and then, you make a bunch of transactions, you can, if I sat down and wrote down a napkin, I say, I will pay you X dollars at Y interest rate, and you say yes, and you sign it, and I sign it, the truth is the law is just going to honor that private contract, right, between individuals, right? And so I think there's a huge amount of decentralized finance or other kind of like crypto or blockchain components where, people are making private contracts between all of them. And to some extent, like Nicholas said, it doesn't map fully against the existing law because copyright is meant to protect a certain way of work in copyright, but there's a private market. And I assume that should be ironed out over time. I don't think it's very controversial. I think it'll just be at the edges and so on and so forth. But there's a function of it. Technology is catching up. We don't understand how it works for quick commerce. We don't understand how it works for smokeless cigarettes, right? E-cigarettes. We don't know how that works for driverless cars. Even today, they just in California, driverless car startups are lobbying and say we should allow driverless cars for trucks, right? Because people are falling asleep. The safety risk for these trucks, having someone be a robot there is going to be better, but the law requires there to be one human person per vehicle. So that's it, right? So I think that's the common dynamic of technology is always that search for law and so forth. But I think the third class is really important, which is bad faith actors, right? And the truth of the matter is that, bad faith actors can take advantage of this asymmetry of information, asymmetry of regulation, and arbitrage / take advantage, honestly, of people who are not well protected, people who are not well informed, and people who are not in the know. And this is, I think, is really driving the regulatory incentive for regulators to be in cluster 2 to start creating regulations. So that's why, the classic story is, shouldn't the industry should self-regulate so as to prevent more regulations of coming in that would be undesired by the industry. And the truth is these bad faith actors, unfortunately, is driving regulation to happen, whether we fully understand it or not, whether it's well designed or not, but it's creating a pressure and the understanding moving forward. And so I think and some companies are going to get caught in a dragnet who are good faith actors. But I think that's something that's inevitable over the next 10, 20 years, is that regulation will be built to, for example, in the public markets, you must be an accredited investor. You must be considered to be sufficiently sophisticated to participate in the equities market, because it's assumed that below a certain threshold, you are highly likely to be a victim of fraud, right? Or scams. And so I think we're probably seeing the groundswell, maybe not right now, but over time, I think we're going to see this happen over time.
Thanks for sharing that, Jeremy. Always very insightful. I always can depend on you to kind of like splice it up in terms of understanding bite pieces. Just like a experienced podcast host. Eric, what's your view about what Jeremy shared in terms of from the perspective as as a company yourself, in terms of from that perspective, anything to top up on what Jeremy has shared?
No, I largely agree. And on my part also, I was obviously very selfishly looking at Dedoco as a business. We are hoping that like the regulation catch up, so that even the kind of like quote unquote I'm trying to find a better word, but the slower adopters of blockchain technologies will see that actually regulations has caught up, and therefore the kind of like the resistance and barrier or adopting technology that has this utilizing the next new wave of things. That whole adoption conversation gets sped up a lot more.
Got it. Yeah, thanks for sharing. And I would like just quickly also kind of like pick the brain of all the speakers here. In terms of broadly from your experience, what have you observed to be interesting trends that's evolving, especially in the laws and regulatory space? That probably will be interesting for our Web3 friends who are listening in today. Is there anything that you picked up in observation or little grapevine channels, or in terms of readings? Maybe you can kind of summarize and pick out the key points if you need to share with us. That would be awesome. Anyone can start, friends, or Jeremy, go ahead.
Share. I think the big one that happened a week ago was the Monetary Authority of Singapore said that there'll be, I believe the phrase was brutal and unrelentingly hard on crypto. And I think that was taken up not necessarily because it's law, but because the regulator and the head leader had that decision, right? And I think most regulators tend to be, kind of like clear, neutral, or, forward-looking. And this was, I think, relatively stronger language, I think, from a regulator perspective. So I think the market is starting to price in the fact that Singapore, to some extent, is going to have more regulation. Obviously, how that shakes up to be, in which domains and so forth is there. But so I think the market of talent and people are going to react first before the regulators actually get around enforcing / creating the regulators as well. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. So I think where the market actually is going to land is going to be waiting for when the Monetary Authority of Singapore actually builds out that full set of black and white the components to see where it lands up.
So probably will be a difficult question by Jeremy, just to pick a look into your own crystal ball. When do you think that will happen?
It's hard to tell. It doesn't happen at once, right? It could be, it could be one thing in a year, another thing another year. So, right. It's hard to tell the timing. But I think the general arc is long, right? Which is that regulators on average in every country will protect their retail investors on average because they're concerned that retail investors may not necessarily fully understand the ramifications of what they're doing. And on average will allow sophisticated institutions to do what needs to be done, as long as they're not a Ponzi scheme or materially fraud or, gross negligence, and all of that, from what I believe, is, covered by corporate law, right? It doesn't need to be a crypto law to be like, willfully material omission / commission of, fraud, right?
Yeah. Good share. Yeah. Eric, Nicholas, what about you guys?
Not well. I'm actually monitoring the DID space, the decentralized ID space, not just in Singapore, but obviously around the region. I think Singapore that has put a step forward with this whole national digital identity and doing eKYC on that part, like. So really interested and to see how other countries around the region adopt this, because that obviously added an extra layer of security in terms of that identity management, right? So, and above and beyond national issued identity, like how what's the reaction towards a enterprise or very, very ironically a centralized organization like recognizing the digital identity database, if you may, right, on that front, like DIDs by enterprises. So for example, like can an employer issue a employer ID that's publicly verifiable by anyone, so that person is kind of like verified as a holding a particular position in a particular company and therefore it translates to having a particular authority level to sign off certain contracts to make it even more legitimized. So I'm monitoring that space. I'm not seeing much progression at this part yet, above and beyond Singapore.
Rajah. Nicholas?
So I guess looking at the kind of cases that come out of court and the kind of questions and discussions I've had with clients, I mean, a couple of broad trends that I've noticed. First of all, in terms of the courts, there has been a recognition of cryptocurrencies and NFTs as assets. This is through two cases where freezing orders, basically worldwide freezing orders, were issued. I'm not sure if you're aware. Basically, they were started from cases where there was either theft of cryptocurrency or a situation whereby an NFT was transferred to somebody else and that person didn't want to return the cryptocurrency, the NFT thereafter. So what the plaintiff did was he went to court to get a worldwide freezing order. And so basically this order prevents the tokens from being dealt with. The idea being that this order would then be served on the brokerages and the exchanges such that you could then prevent the token from being traded. And this could be done in any country that would recognize the Singapore judgment. So, I mean, it's a positive step forward for situations whereby there's crypto theft, which is something that is becoming, unfortunately, more and more prevalent. And it also, as I said, is an indication that the Singapore courts at least recognize, tokens as an asset class. The other thing I've noticed is something that I touched on earlier, which is the licensing of NFTs. And obviously, a lot of people, when they refer to NFTs, always talk about ownership. That's the one thing that they always talk about. But the reality is, as I said, if all the NFT contains is a license to use the image, then you don't actually own the image. You may own the token, but you don't own the image. And that's something that's important for buyers of NFTs to recognize, because every license is different. So you have to know what you want to do with the image and what that license enables you to do. So, for example, if you're like Seth Green and you want to create a movie out of your ape, you have to make sure that the license enables you to do that. And if it doesn't, then you open yourself to liability. Similarly, if you're perhaps you have a metaverse, you're one of those gaming companies, and one of the services you offer is to digitize the NFT of a player into a character on your metaverse. It's important for you to also know whether or not the license of the NFT holder enables you to do that. And that can lead to a lot of questions, obviously, because, as I said, every license is different. The last thing I've kind of noticed is that there seems to be perhaps a misconception that smart contracts can solve everything. So I raised some issues earlier on regards to licensing, and some people believe that through the smart contract we can solve all these problems, and I think that's a bit difficult in the case of licensing in particular, because the smart contract is not going to be able to tell how you use the NFT outside of what happens to the token. So if you're of the view that you want your smart contract to cater to more than just the question of remuneration, that's something you probably have to discuss with your lawyer, because we would have to basically map what the code does vis-a-vis what you want to try to do in terms of your contractual rights. So that's another area that we have to increasingly look at.
Thank you, Nicholas. Very insightful as usual. Well, I'm also cognizant of time, so what I'm going to do is I would like to just jump to one of the questions I think is pretty interesting, in the panel, and let's quickly tackle that. Well, basically, James actually asked, does a play-to-earn guild need to register as a business in the country they are HQing, which basically they are in Singapore? And are the guild members players contractors, or have another designation and as such need to follow certain employment guidelines? I'm not sure if this is something that will find a conversation, especially in an employment, guidelines kind of conversation. But perhaps from a legal perspective, perhaps maybe someone like Nicholas. I mean, would you be able to give a quick perspective to this question?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I think I'm not an expert in this space because I'm not a corporate lawyer. But I would say that the key concern with incorporation really is to make sure that your liability is limited. That's the main reason. I don't necessarily think that there's a law out there that says that your specific area is something that needs to be registered. And maybe in future it may be the case, or it may turn also on the legality of what you're doing. If there's a gambling element or a game that you need to take into account. I think that the key concern for me would be limitation of liability. Moving on to the question of employment, I mean, I think it's quite clear what the definition of employees are. And I'm not sure that your case would really fall under that. But basically, yeah, we would have to look at the nature of your members and whether or not they are employees in the sense they earn the salary for. There's some legal definition as to how someone is an employee, and I wouldn't necessarily say that yours falls under that, but we will have to take a look.
No problem. Thanks for sharing, Nicholas. As James correctly also mentioned, we've got a little bit of free legal advice tonight as well from you. Yeah, with thanks to that. Well, as I mentioned, I'm cognizant of time. We are actually overrunning already. So I think most importantly, I want to thank all the speakers today. Jeremy again from Mangsil Ventures, Eric from Dedoco, and basically Nicholas from Rajah Tann Asia. So, respectively, if you reach out to them in terms of how you'd like to breach some partnership potentially, or how you can work with them, I'm sure you can find them on LinkedIn and you can actually reach out to them directly. Yeah, with that, actually, I would like to thank, all the speakers for your time tonight and all the people who are listening in. Thank you for your time as well.
Thanks, Doug.